Welcome to Kingdoms in Conflict. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wallace. With the push for critical race theory, gender equality, and comprehensive sex education in public schools, is it time to take our children out of the public school system? And if so, where should we place them? Charter schools, Christian schools, or homeschooling? Latasha Fields of the Epic Cafe, who is advocating for an exodus from public schools, is here to discuss this and more when we return. Welcome to Kingdoms in Conflict. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wallace, and we're privileged to have with us today Evangelist Latasha Fields. How are you doing today, my sister?
I'm great. How are you, Dr. Wallace?
I am great, and thank you for being on our program. Now, you know that Kingdoms in Conflict is a Christian show, and although everyone who comes on is not necessarily a Christian or professing Christian, however, you are. So if you don't mind, please tell our audience a little bit about how you came to the Lord and how you got into your ministry.
Yeah, thank you again so much for having me, Dr. Wallace. It is definitely a privilege. My journey for Christ has been, I think, a very unique one. So I've been now a disciple of Christ for about 17 years. And it was just through a lot of different hardships, as most of us have those stories. But it was really me being a single mom, just tired of everything. You know, I grew up Baptist, of course, but you know, it's with all of us, when we get older, we tend to do our own thing. And it just came a point in my life where the burden of life was really weighing on me. And I was just really, really tired, Dr. Wallace. And it, as my grandmother would say, just try Jesus. and so I did. I just felt like I had nothing else to lose, nothing else to gain. I felt that I had done everything that I wanted to do, if you will, to provide for me and my daughter. And so she was really my motivation, because I grew up, you know, my grandmother raised me, so I didn't have my mom and my dad in my life. You know, unfortunately, my mom was on drugs and different things. And I really wanted to provide a better life for her beyond financial means, beyond material means. And so she was my strongest motivation for giving my life to Christ. And having hope that I would give her a better life. Because what I think most people maybe don't realize, that there's so much safety in the psychological part of us and in the spiritual part of us. And that's what I wanted to protect.
So you were a single parent when you came to the Lord?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
She was 8 years old when I got saved, yes.
Okay. Well, how did you get into ministry?
Well, when I got saved, a friend girl of mine that I met invited me to a church, and long story short, and when I got to this ministry, this was in 2004, my now husband was preaching and teaching, and I heard the Lord so audibly saying, "That's him," you know. And so I'm sitting there like, "That's him what?" You know. And so long story short, 6 months later, we were married.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so with that's how I got in ministry. And actually, a month later, after going to that church and meeting my husband, I began teaching a month after that. So to be precise, that I met my husband and joined that church March 2004, April, not even a month, 2004. My husband, who was not my husband then, we were preaching and teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so God really took me really fast in terms of the call on my life. And so it's just been an extraordinary journey ever since. And I became the youth pastor of that church and youth minister. And he began to deal with me even prior to that time, very strongly about our youth. And just coming myself from such an out-risk background and where I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, he was really tugging on my heart about a lot of things that were happening to our youth and within our communities.
So now you have a ministry that you call Epic Cafe. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Epic Cafe was birthed about maybe 3-4 years ago. And it's an acronym for actually what we want to mobilize to do. We literally want to empower parents and ignite communities. And we got cafe on it because I wanted to be social, in terms of just having conversations that really foster change, that really change people's mind. Because the Bible says faith come by hearing, and hearing the word of God. And so we have to have these conversations about what's happening in our community. And my career background is real estate. And so I've been in real estate over 20 years. And what I've seen in the real estate industry that I took into evangelism is that so many times I've seen where we will revitalize the communities in terms of the paint and the brick and mortar and all these things. But what the Lord was showing me over the years, what was never revitalized or what was never empowered was the people's minds. And so EPIC is an order. You first empower the people, and then is inevitably that the communities will change. And so that's what we're doing with EPIC. Literally, we just want to reach our people, love on them, and empower them with the tools they needed to make their lives better.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that EPIC was actually stood for something else. What did you say? It was empowering people?
Empowering parents,
empowering parents.
Empowering parents and igniting communities. Because again, when you look at the Abrahamic covenant, that was the promise God gave Abraham. In thee, all nations and all families of the earth will be blessed. Mm-hmm. And so we believe that the epitome of our society rests within the family and the restoration of the family. And so that's why it's empowering the parents, and then we'll ignite communities.
Speaking of empowering parents, I know one of the things that you really are passionate about is education, and you've been homeschooling. So tell us how you got involved in homeschooling and why homeschooling is such a passion for you.
Yes. So going back to my testimony, my husband and I got married in 2005. And so 2003, the Lord was already dealing with me about, again, what was happening with youth, my own personal journey with a lot of things with education and family structure. And so I believe that once I married my husband, because we strongly believe in family and that covering, that's when he really began to, if you would, develop that ministry within both of us in terms of where we were going, what we were going to do, and where we were going to be sent in terms of education and our children. And so early part of 2006, my husband and I had been married a year. The Lord just began to deal with me about, again, just kids. And I was just like, God, I wasn't a teenager to babysit. So it was just like, I don't know if I want to be dealing with kids, But it just was impressed upon my heart in terms of the at-risk. Now, the education component wasn't a part of what he was telling me in the beginning. And so August 7th or August 13th, 2006, I took my daughter to school, literally the first day of school. And as I dropped her off, started driving back home, I probably didn't get but a mile up the road. The Lord spoke to me so audibly that I had to pull over my car on side of the street and just weep. And I heard him, as though me and you're talking here today, turn around and go get her, you're gonna homeschool. And as most of us know, within the Black community, because again, we were in Baton Rouge, I had never in my life heard of homeschooling. I didn't even know it was legal. I didn't even know we even had the right to teach our children per se. Just typical parent, typical thoughts about everything when it comes to education. But I couldn't shake it. And I went back to that school. I didn't know Louisiana law. I didn't have no drop form. I didn't know anything that I know now or that I've been knowing for the past 15 years. And I went back to that school literally weeping. And the principal then was trying to console me. And honestly, Dr. Wallace, I was telling them the Lord told me to homeschool. And of course, they thought I had lost my mind. And they were just trying to just console me. And I just kept saying, give me my baby. The Lord told me to homeschool. And surprisingly, they called her off the speaker and she came to the principal's office. And of course, she was 9 years old. So she seen me crying. She just started crying immediately. And I just started hugging and I just said, Mama, go teach you. Mama, go teach you. She's just like, okay. And so I get back in the car and I called my husband and he's just like, all right, let's do it. And that was our journey with homeschooling. And so then I get home and then I begin to research, like, what in the world did I just do? What just happened here? And I to my amazement, the little that I found then, homeschooling was such a world of itself. And that is actually our testimony, our journey. And so as the Lord began to teach me and my husband more and more of just removing the veils, if you will, of the public education system and what his heart is for family. And it's just to make children disciples of Jesus Christ. And he began to tell me immediately that I did not bring her home for academics. And so I think that's what a lot of people think when you say homeschooling, because it has such a trending privilege thing on it. And I tell people all the time in our group, don't think we're trying to raise valedictorians. We are really trying to make them disciples of Christ. And then the education is the bonus. We do that, of course. But God really pressed upon me and my husband. It was really about saving our children's souls because of the indoctrinations of the public school. And it wasn't even what's happening now. So that's our story and how we started. And I immediately became an advocate for homeschooling. Immediately. Like I went just running my mouth off to everybody, the church, just everybody. It just was a fire igniting in me in terms of this is what we have to do. This is what we have to do for our children. We got to get them out.
Recently, I know you started talking to people about taking their kids out of public schools. What is that all about?
Well, again, when we started, so we've been homeschooling 15 years now, and I have 4 children. So my oldest daughter she'll be 25 next month. And so again, we pulled her out of public school in 4th grade. I homeschooled her all the way to 12th. She finished college 2 years ago, 2019, and she has a bachelor's in science and nutrition. And so I have 3 more, 2 boys, 14, 12, and then a baby girl that's 5. So my passion for advocating has not just started with the sex bill. Again, I have been from Louisiana to Illinois, encouraging parents to pull their children out of public school. And again, even though we know all these things have been what we call pandemic, what we're seeing today or what we've been seeing for the last 10 years probably wasn't even thought about when we started homeschooling, especially the very aggressive indoctrinations that we're seeing. And so moving to Illinois 10 years ago to this particular state, which is, as we all know, is more democratically controlled, the policies here are working more egregiously to destroy the family structure. And so God sending my husband and I here for ministry, for evangelism, that just kind of increased what God wanted us to do in terms of reaching families in the state of Illinois. And so that would really put us on the trail to say, no, we definitely got to get them out. Because again, Louisiana has more, if you will, for the most part, still operating in more conservative values when it comes to the political spectrum. And so here it's just a whole nother ball game with families here and with the public education system here. And so that's why we have really been saying get them out, because the sexual and the social construct of the public school system here is just very harmful. It's very, very, very unhealthy for our children.
You've been warning people, especially in Illinois, and you live in Chicago, correct?
Yes.
In the school system here, they're talking about the comprehensive sex education and a sexualization of our children. Is this phenomena only in, as far as you know, only in the Illinois schools, or is this nationwide?
Well, I know California, of course, have been trailblazers in this whole LGBTQ plus movement and the sexualization of our children. And New York has remnants of it too, but Illinois, as far as I know, is the first state to legalize the national sex education standards. And then we know, unfortunately, Governor Pritzker signed it into law on Friday. And so now the whole sex ed curriculum has completely changed. And one good thing, if there be a good thing with this bill that is now law here in the state of Illinois, parents can't opt their children out of this program. But our advocacy is to take them completely out of the public education system, because we're seeing that this thing is snowballing. It's not slowing down. They're getting more and more aggressive in terms of sexualizing our children. And so we really, really, really want to urge parents to heavily consider the weightier matters of their children's life, which is their souls, not just their academics. And then we can even take that angle. The academics is poor. There's no quality education in public education schools. The Common Core is ruining our children's basic ability to read and write in terms of the literacy rate. So it's just a bad deal altogether.
I understand that the United Nations is also pushing this kind of agenda, the sexualization of our children and other things that they're pushing forward.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And so that's why I tell people it's a global agenda. So this thing been started since Alfred Kinsey. You're talking about the early 60s. I mean, we can go further back than that. You can go all the way back to Horace Mann. You're talking about the late 1800s. And so when we're having meetings and we're discussing this with parents, and church leaders and community leaders alike, we're telling them that we're not just trying to come up with a catchy word. It's really planned. And so what we have been seeing in the last 120 years or so, in terms of the public education system, these things seemingly look like they happen overnight, but they have been slowly and strategically laid out. And so what we're seeing now is what was planned then, because they want this Unitarian concept of school, this Marxist ideology of education. And so that's why we're saying, people think homeschooling is new. No, homeschooling has been around for antiquity. The public education system is what's new. And so we all need to go back to literally taking responsibility of our children and our communities and our church leaders. We need to take back our families and take back our communities. I mean, this is vital.
So are you only pushing homeschooling, or are you open to the whole idea of school choice, like charter schools, private schools, faith-based schools, and things like that?
We're open to every school choice but public school and charter. Because public and charter is one and the same. So no, I do not advocate for charter or public school. We are strictly homeschooling, private and private Christian schools. That's where we stop with school choice. And also we are believing God that we would begin to mobilize and empower and encourage our communities even more so to open up, private Christian community schools, or we're just calling community co-op schools. And my inspiration for that, more so, if you will, is Booker T. Washington. And so when I'm talking to people, especially our people, it's like it's foreign to them. Like we've done this before. This is not the first time we've even had the thought of having our own schools. And so it's like not just doing what Booker T. Washington and Julian Rosenwald did, but let's just do it better. Let's really take back our communities and teach our own kids. And then this whole fight about inequality in education and racism and CRT and all these, I'm just like, if you take them out of their system, you just won't have that fight. You don't have to worry about inequality in education when you're supporting your children's education. That's what I tell people. I don't have inequality in education, because whatever me and my husband, God has blessed us with and we can financially afford it, we do it for our children. And so that would eliminate all of this. That would eliminate all this racism and all these things that we keep fighting these systems for. It would eliminate that if we would just take authority and take back our children.
And if the system's corrupt and not even teaching white kids very well, it doesn't matter. you need to change the system. Calling it racist isn't really going to change anything. I know at one point you actually ended up speaking on Capitol Hill. Was that on this topic here, or was it something else?
Well, it was my personal testimony, which this was all mixed up in it. And so, so it was my personal testimony again about my journey to salvation, marrying my husband, my career in education, and just growing up in Baton Rouge, as they would say, the ghetto, the hood, just the typical upbringing. Unfortunately, my mother was on drugs, in and out of prison, and just to see the hand of God on me and my husband's life, of how we were able to persevere, not because of our own strength, but because of Christ. And people need to hear our heart. And my husband's testimony is, if you will, has more heartbreak than mine, in terms of him being a young man, got saved at 21 years old, and gave his life to Christ early, was gang banging and doing all those things that we seeing happening now. And again, me being a single mom, having a baby at 17 years old. So when we're out in our communities talking to our people, we're not coming from a place where we don't understand. We're not coming from a place where we haven't been there. And that's why I detest when people tell me what these parents can't do. Yes, we can, because I was able to do it. Millions of us have been able to do it. And guess what? We will continue to be able to do it with the right support system and having our faith in Christ. Seriously, uncliched, we can do all things through Christ. And a lot of these things that we're dealing with, these barriers, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not that. It's not going to happen overnight. But if we're diligent and if we're consistent and if our faith is anchored, we can prevail. So that's what I told Capitol Hill. And then a big chunk of it was about the economic disadvantage of our communities, economic poverty. And so I was able to share with them, because it was a huge attack on me and another pastor that was there, because we were coming against the social welfare system. And I told him I was on welfare for 2 years. I've been there. I did the WIC programs. I did the child care programs. But I told him, the woman that I am today, those things did not make me the woman that I am today. I don't have a college degree because I stayed on welfare. I didn't buy a home at 18 years old because I stayed on welfare, So those things are what we would like to call, they're a rat race. They only help to a certain extent. And I share with them, I'm not saying completely dissolve the safety net in this country, but it needs to be reformed. And then we do not need to encourage people to stay continually dependent on government, because government is not our inheritance. The Bible says that we are to lay up an inheritance for our children's children's children, and government dependency and welfare is not going to do it. So we need to be encouraging education. We need to be encouraging trade and skills and vocational skills, entrepreneurialism. And so that's what I was able to tell those on Capitol Hill. And then, Dr. Wiles, I posed a question to them. None of you have gotten where you are by staying on welfare. You're not our elected officials because you just kept encouraging government dependency and welfare. No, someone in your family encouraged you to go to school, get law degrees, etc. And so once I made that statement, I'm like, what are y'all talking about? We're talking about hard work. We're talking about being responsible and accountable to our choices. And if we want to see our communities uplifted out of poverty, well, these are the skills and these are the ideas, if you will, that we need to be bringing into our community. We need to bring back these entrepreneurial skills and education and trade skills, and encouraging families, encouraging marriage, and all these things. Right. That's how you survive.
Well, I thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate what you're doing, you and your husband. Look forward to seeing you all again. Yes. You're also a member of the 1776 Unite program. We're not able to talk about that, but maybe the next time you come on, we'll be able to talk about that. And for those of you who are watching, we'll be back in just a moment. Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Wallace, President and co-founder of Freedom's Journal Institute for the Study of Faith and Public Policy. And I'm here today to tell you about a project that we're really excited about. It's called Racism in America and the Role of the Church.
We live in a time and day of conspiracy, a threat to the poor, a threat to the have-nots.
We're doing this series because we believe that the Black church needs to hear another voice. There's a voice out there that is secular. Society as well as the media are pushing the narrative that there's a resurgence in racism in America, especially with the rise of groups like Black Lives Matter and other protest groups. It's tearing the church apart. And I believe it's time for the church in general, and the African American church in particular, to have another voice that has a different point of view, a biblical worldview. I'd ask you to prayerfully consider making a donation to this project. Thank you. Welcome back. In 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 through 3, Paul writes to Timothy, who is in Ephesus. Paul states, quote, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and the teachings of demons, through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth," end quote. For the early church, the latter times began after the ascension of Jesus into heaven. Attacks on the church and its teachings were prime targets as they are today. Paul, in this context, is talking about some form of asceticism or early Gnostic practice, calling his opponents liars. They cannot discern the truth because their consciences are seared, like the searing of a brand on an animal or a slave. They are forbidding marriage and the consuming of certain foods, contrary to the Word of God. These are the teachings of the demons. They contradict what God said, like the serpent in the garden in Genesis chapter 3. The instigators of such instruction are listening to deceitful or deceptive spirits. Their forbidding to marry, we'd say today, is a direct attack on the family. And today that attack on marriage is more about allowing people to marry whomever they want, apart from the normative heterosexual marriage we see talked about in critical queer theory. Paul warns while in prison in his letter to the very same church in Ephesus. He tells us, quote, "to put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil," in verse 11. He reminds us in verse 12, quote, "for we do not wrestle against the flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places," end quote. Critical race theory is antithetical to biblical Christianity, and it is rushing into our public schools like a flood. and creeping into our Christian schools like a virus. It affects everything it touches. Critical race theory comes from critical theory, which originates in Marxism and is developed in the Frankfurt School. It is a worldview that sees everything through the lenses of the oppressed versus the oppressor. They seek freedom from all forms of domination. When Marxists couldn't overthrow Western society through insurrection, they decided to infiltrate society by other means. An Italian Marxist philosopher who Mussolini imprisoned, Antonio Gramsci, wrote, quote, "Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society," end quote. They are in the process of doing just that. One must come to realize that, quote, "the issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution," end quote, or what is now called social Marxism. Former law professor Derek Bell is considered the intellectual father of critical race theory. In the book Critical Race Theory, authors Richard Delgado, Jean Stefanik say that Bell argued, quote, "that civil rights advances for blacks always seem to coincide with changing economic conditions and self-interest of elite whites. Sympathy, mercy, and evolving standards of social decency and conscience amount to little, if anything," end quote. In other words, whites only do what is in their best interest, including any civil rights initiatives. Critical race theory is critical of the meritocracy because they believe that race determines who gets into the best schools, the best jobs, invites to parties, etc. Thus, hard work and effort are a myth. Critical race theory is just another attempt to bring confusion into the fabric of our society and tear it down. It's not the first time, though. In 1958, former communist Manning Johnson wrote a book entitled, quote, "Color, Communism, and Common Sense," end quote, talking about the tactics of the Communist Party. He said on page 21 that the Communist Party, quote, "created doubt, lack of confidence, and suspicion, setting up situations that bring about racial bitterness, violence, and conflict, putting forth demands so unrealistic that race relations are worsened, attacking everybody in disagreement as reactionaries, fascists, Ku Kluxers among whites, and Uncle Toms among Negroes, constitute the Reds' pattern of operation," end quote. This quote is an encapsulation of critical race theory today. This is not something we should be teaching our children. Proverbs 22:6 says, quote, "Train up a child in the way they should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it," end quote. Paul again says that we are in spiritual warfare in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 4 through 5. Quote, "For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ," end quote. Critical race theory is an argument against the knowledge of God. We are kingdoms in conflict.